And they do.
We're good. They have it right there for you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming to this breakout session on the dynamics of rural housing crisis. I'm gonna just talk a little bit. I've been in government for about 20 years, and for the first 15 years, it was always, we need jobs, we need jobs, we need jobs, right? And the focus wasn't on housing at all necessarily, although Diane, being a lifelong housing person, has always been focused on housing, but I would say generally the public wasn't concerned about housing. I'm here to tell you we have a housing crisis today in Itasca County. We have a ton of jobs. You can go to some of the local websites. I watch minnesotaworks.net. Up until about 6 months ago, there was typically 145 full-time jobs available. When I was on there 2 weeks ago, it's up to about 250 full-time jobs within a 25-mile range of the city of Grand Rapids. So the question is, where do those 250 people live? Where do they buy homes? And if you talk to any realtor right now, I see a couple in the front row. It's tough. It's tough out there. City of Grand Rapids has a laser focus on housing right now. We'll be redeveloping the Forest Lake site. Diane Larson is going to be involved with that. But as a community, we need to be focused on housing. So I'm excited. Today we've got Elizabeth Glidden. She's the Deputy Executive Director at MHP, where she drives MHP policy and program initiatives towards outcomes that improve the quality, affordability, and availability of housing in Minnesota and beyond. She's a public policy professional and lawyer with 25 years experience. Elizabeth served as council member for the city of Minneapolis from 2006 to 2017. Oh, you poor soul.
I know. No, I was like,
thank God you're out there right now.
I am.
Elizabeth began her career as an employment lawyer, representing individuals for over 10 years with her firm. Is it Hedin, Goldberg, and Glidden PAs. Diane Larson, who most of you probably know, is the executive director of the Itasca County HRA. She's worked in housing for over 30 years and currently oversees the administration, management, and programs of the HRA, including 335 plus units of housing, approximately 350 rental assistance vouchers, and rehabilitation programs. Diane has been an active member of the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, also known as NARO, for many years, having served as Senior Vice President, and currently the immediate past President and State Legislative Chair on the Board of Directors. Diane is also a board member on the North Central Regional Council of NARO, serving an 8-state region, and was recently appointed by NARO President Sunny Shah to the National Budget and Administration Committee. She also holds a public housing manager certification. So thanks to both of you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Tom. That was quite an introduction. Thank you very, very much. I just want to say that I am super excited that Elizabeth could come up and spend this time with us today. She definitely is a housing advocate. She's a housing professional. She knows a lot about housing. So I'm super excited that she was willing to come up here and share her expertise with us. Today, we've got a little bit of an agenda for you. And this worked right before you all came in. There you go.
Yeah.
First, we're going to talk just a little bit about housing basics to make sure that we're all using the same terminology today when we have a conversation. We're going to talk very, very briefly about what MHP does and what the HRA does. But then we're really going to dive into what is the state of housing in Minnesota. And then we're going to compare that to Itasca County. So we can see how we compare with the state in terms of our need and in terms of what Tom just alluded to, the housing crisis that I think you'll see is a statewide issue also. And then we're going to talk about some of what are the development challenges. Why isn't more housing being developed across our state and in Itasca County? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then there are a multitude of potential solutions. We've picked out just a few to talk about. And there may be the more innovative solutions or some new things that we know are coming down the pike in 2022. And finally, we're going to leave some time at the end for questions and answers or dialogue about housing that you all in this room want to have. So turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. So wanted to just introduce MHP a little bit so you understand more about our organization and what are some of the things that we work on. MHP is a 30+ year nonprofit that works in housing and community development, and we have three main areas of our work. One is we work on policy, and that is primarily at the state level, where we work on proposals affecting housing policy. We also produce original research. You have an example in front of you, the county profile of some of the types of research that we produce on a regular basis. And finally, we also work directly with communities, and you can go ahead and advance that slide. We provide technical assistance and focus that work on serving rural communities and Native nations. That work is grounded in work in Minnesota. These are just some examples of where we work throughout the state of Minnesota, and our staff that does that work now also works throughout the country as well.
Minnesota is home to about 154 housing and redevelopment authorities, or HRAs. We are a governmental unit. And when I talk about what work the HRA typically does, I like to put that into four kind of buckets, and I'm just going to do a very high level summary. So one of the things in one of our largest programs or pieces of work that we do is a rental assistance administrator. We bring in both federal and state funding into Itasca County to provide rental assistance to households, to families, to senior citizens, to disabled individuals. And we're able to subsidize about 345 households per month. And on an annual basis, that brings in about $1.9 million from the federal and state governments directly into Itasca County that is then dispersed out to private landlords in our county. We also, as an HRA, are a landlord. We actually own and manage rental properties. We currently own 10 properties across Itasca County, serving, there's about 400 units in those 10 properties. We do manage some of those properties, and we also hire out the management of some of those properties. Kind of our third major bucket is we're a developer and a redeveloper. Redeveloper, really we concentrate on preservation efforts. How can we preserve the housing that we already have on the ground here in Itasca County, so we also aren't going backwards and losing units? And a brief example of that is we recently contracted with the city of Grand Rapids to do some single family rehabilitation and some commercial rehabilitation right in the core downtown area. We also develop housing. We have developed a housing project in Calumet, Taconite, Big Fork. Our most recent project is the new Aurora Heights project, which many of you might have seen being constructed on the site of the former Riverview School. And that's going to be a 56-unit housing project, new project to our community. Finally, we are a partner. We want to partner with communities in Itasca County to do redevelopment if we can. We partner with other HRAs in the region to bring some of that state rental assistance in, and we'll partner with supportive service organizations to bring supports into our buildings for senior citizens or those who might need some supports to live independently. I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about terminology. Real quickly, affordable housing can mean something different to every single person in this room. If I went around the room, we might have a lot of different definitions. Today, the definition we're going to use is something is affordable to a household when they are paying less than 30% of their monthly income towards their housing costs. That could be a mortgage, that could be their rent. So that's what we're going to determine today as being affordable housing. The second term that we're going to use quite frequently throughout the presentation is cost burdened. And cost burdened is when a family or a household is paying more than 30% of their income towards rent or towards their mortgage. And finally, a couple of times I'm going to refer to severely cost burdened, and that is when a household is paying more than 50% or more than half of their monthly income towards their housing cost. In a Harvard State of the Nation's housing study done in 2017, one of the things that researchers found is that Families, when they are cost burdened or paying too much for their housing, they have a lot less expendable cash to spend on other necessities like food, transportation, and healthcare. And here you can see the blue bars represent the amount that families on the left with children are spending. On the right, seniors, here defined as age 65 and over, are spending if their housing is not cost burdened. The yellow bars represent the decrease in the level of spending if families are paying more than 30% or more than 50% of their income on housing.
Maybe one additional thing I'll add here. First, just a reminder, these terms apply to all income brackets. So we're not focusing on any one income bracket using this term cost burden. The state of Minnesota, according to Minnesota Housing, now has about 25% of households are what's considered cost burdened. And that's something that's really changed over the last 20 years. I think they said it's like almost 60% increase in that percent of how many households are experiencing cost burden, which means they have less to spend in the general community. So we're going to continue on with just some information that applies to the state of Minnesota, because we think this also then will continue to go more local with the information that we're sharing. But going back to the introduction, when we talked about kind of the news now, or the talk now is a lot about housing, how do we have housing to serve our workforce? We go back in time and really go back to what's pinpointed as the Great Recession. This is a time when housing production just plummeted. This is this graph down here. We had a severe reduction in matching the need for housing with production in housing, and we just have never caught up. So this is the situation we are in right now, where we need, the state of Minnesota has said we need 300,000 new housing units of any kind. This means single family homes, any sort of housing for all income levels by the year 2030. And we need that to catch up. So this is just a graph that shows a little bit about what is actually getting produced in Minnesota in terms of housing that meets certain income brackets versus what is needed. So I know it might be hard to see this in particular, but if you look at the bottom graph, kind of those squares are more evenly spaced, and that actually applies to different income levels. If we produce the housing that matched the needs of our community, which is spread over kind of all this income bracket, that's what that housing production would look like. But what is being produced is what's in that top burden, where almost all of the production is meeting a certain income bracket of 80% and above. And even with that, we are very challenged in not meeting our needs. But then if you look at the very end of that bracket, we're only producing a few hundred and sometimes less than that types of housing units that meet our very lowest income residents. So we're not producing the housing that matches that need. Another way to look at those numbers is here. We have about 170,000 households or individuals, excuse me, that match that lowest income bracket. And we do not have housing for about 100,000 of them. So what happens when that's the case? It usually means that people are not in safe and stable housing situations. So they might be doubled up. They might be moving place to place. They might be in an unsanitary and unsafe housing condition. And then also their family is not supported, and all those other things that happen when you're not in a good housing situation. The state of Minnesota also is receiving renown for many years now of, in a bad way, which is that we are kind of topping all these lists of disparities based on race, and housing is one of those characteristics. And so when we think about policy and program creation, we want to think about how we are reversing those disparities. Just as one example of how these disparities came to be is going back in time to creation of our first major single family home loan program, which excluded in its initial creation Black residents. this is me. Okay, we're trading off. And so this is, so we're gonna again kind of keep on this Minnesota data and then drop down into the county level data. So here we're showing a comparison of what people make to what housing costs. And side by side, we have here owner households. So most of that is single family home ownership versus renter households. And so first I'm going to just point out on that renter household, what we've seen over the last 20 years, since 2020, is that rent is rising, although not maybe exponentially, and that may be what's expected. But what we're also seeing is that income is fairly stagnant at 1%. These are statewide numbers. So then we're going to take a peek at what's happening on the more local level. The owner household, that's a little bit more mixed picture. I think we're seeing value go up, but in some ways that's a good thing. We want to see value go up in assets that we own. But we're also seeing income is not fully matching what some of that cost might be driving for owner households. Next slide. This is also a very popular chart that we have started producing that matches what we see as those top in-demand jobs. This is again for the state of Minnesota, and we have done this for each region and then by counties with that housing data. So here we're seeing this matched against what is typical housing costs. So we have, and you probably can't read this, but we have home health, retail salespersons, stockers and order fillers, registered nurses. This is the one that makes the grade in terms of being able to support home ownership as well as 2-bedroom apartments. And then we have retail sales supervisors. So again, just a picture of what are those top jobs, in-demand jobs, and how does that match to what's the cost of housing?
So I'm going to jump in and bring that more to the local level. So we look at some state statistics, and I want to talk about how do we here in Itasca County compare to the state, and are our needs similar, and how do we compare? So here is a similar chart. In Itasca County in general, we have about 80% home ownership, 20% renters. That's kind of our split of our housing stock. So here, this chart is looking at owner households, 80% of all households. And since the year 2000, or in that same 20-year time span, what we see is that our home values have gone up in general by about 40%. What we don't know about this number is you know, how do seasonal properties affect that? How do lake properties affect that? So this is probably not in every single community in Itasca County, but just in general, our home values in 20 years have gone up by about 40%. Again, that can be a good thing in terms of wealth building, or if you have a home that is your asset, right? However, owner incomes have not kept pace with that. In the last 20 years, our incomes have not gone up by 40%, but in Itasca County, they've gone up by about 6%. So if you compare this to the state, on a statewide basis, I think what Elizabeth said is the home values had gone up, I think, by 24%, owner incomes the same, 6%. So our home values here in Itasca County have increased at a faster pace even than the statewide averages. And here's the same slide, but looking at the renters. Again, rents have gone up by about 16% in the last 20 years. But I think what's staggering here is our renter incomes have gone down by about 22%. So what this does is creates a value gap between what a family can afford based on what their income is. And if you remember, on a statewide basis, the renter incomes were pretty stagnant. They've gone up by about 1%. Ours have actually decreased here in Itasca County. In this chart, I'm going to talk a little bit about cost burden. And again, I think what's a couple of things here. If you look on this graph, the owners are represented in the green bars. Not important that you can read the actual numbers. The blue represent our renters in Itasca County. So if you are looking at a household making, up to $50,000 a year, those homeowners, about 29% of them are cost burdened. They are paying more than 30% of their monthly income towards their mortgage. But as you go down the income spectrum and look at a family that makes, or an individual that makes less than $20,000 a year, that increases to 72%. Overarchingly, down at the bottom, I think what should be concerning to us as a community is there's almost 2,000 households in Itasca County that are severely cost burdened, whether that's rent or whether that's mortgage. We've got a lot of households paying more than, about 2,000 households paying more than 50% of their monthly income towards their housing costs. And this chart is just a different way of looking at those numbers. This chart gives the actual numbers of renters and homeowners in those categories. And I guess what I would just point out here is that this chart actually looks at our senior citizens in the county. And we have about 2,000 senior citizens that are cost burdened. And if you look at total of cost burdened households across the county, whether that be a renter or a homeowner, there's about 5,000 households that are cost burdened in our county. This is a similar chart to what Elizabeth pointed out with the jobs that are trending and expected to trend as the fastest growing jobs in our community over the next 10 years. The green bar shows the income needed to support a modest value home. And again, it's the registered nurse, which is a growing, trending job in terms of number of jobs needed in our community. And that reaches that income level needed to afford that home. But none of the other fastest growing positions do meet that, the income required to purchase a modest value home here in the county.
So yeah, bottom line here is that housing is just inextricably intertwined with economic development. And so we laid out, it might not look pretty, but a little bit of a chart just to have you thinking about what are those indirect benefits that flow from housing, both from the construction and from just having the housing in place once it's there. I saw that Senator Bach is one of your guests this evening. He is expert on thinking about that construction end and the jobs that are important as part of that construction process. Indirect benefits can also include how you think about your property tax, your tax base increasing. And then I'll just say on the kind of the residents end of things, that we have really seen with the pandemic kind of hitting home this message of how important having that stability in a home situation is to education, to workforce, just all these other things that are connected to the general economy.
And I would only add in there too, I think one of the indirect benefits, in addition to children coming home from school and having a safe place to do their homework, as she mentioned, I think health. There's been a real proven connection between the health of the community, the health of our residents, and having safe, affordable housing. So I think there's some real benefits in terms of housing and having an adequate housing supply.
Another thing to think about is that for every community, there's usually some range to the type of housing that is needed in support of that community. So we have a bunch of examples here of the typical types of housing, supportive housing that can be used as a broad term, but thinking about what are those supports that seniors may need and others who need help in their home situation, down to thinking about who might need that apartment situation or desire that apartment situation versus a single family home. And how does that add into how you think about your housing goals? Just wanted to call out this term because it is a very popularly used term. And I like to think of it as a bit of a term of art. I say that because each community kind of often puts their definition on workforce housing, and that often fits what are the needs within that community. Sometimes it's used to refer to a particular program. There are some programs at the state of Minnesota that use that word workforce, and then that needs to match that. But again, we're really talking about what is the housing that you need that fits the workers and the workforce in your community. So this is always kind of the million-dollar question that's discussed right now. What is the reason it's so hard to create new housing? What are the challenges to construction? And I often just kind of pop down to the bottom line here, which is that the market just doesn't always support producing housing that meets the needs of your community. It is not always working. And we want to figure out what can we do to help that market work better, or where are special places to put in additional supports to make sure you have the housing that fits the needs of your community. These are some of the most typical elements that go into why that housing is challenging. We've got a lot of need. We've got population growing or workforce growing. We already talked about reduced supply. We have these costs, some of which you just can't change those costs. And we've got this mismatch. A couple other things I'll say that kind of come up in more in rural areas. One is you need to match housing to the size of your community. And sometimes that means that a developer may say, well, it's challenging. I don't know, I can't build X size of property. I need to build something that fits this community. And then they have some value gap in trying to figure out how can I produce that, say a four unit structure or an 8-unit structure as opposed to something bigger.
And I would just add, particular to Itasca County here, towards the end of 2019, the HRA and some other partners worked with 4 communities in Itasca County to have an in-depth housing analysis done of those communities. They were Nashwauk, Big Fork, Cohasset, and Grand Rapids participated in this project. And good news is that unlike many other rural communities in Minnesota where they're looking at population decline or household decline, throughout our county over the last 10 years, we are adding households. Doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be a particular community, but overarchingly, we are adding households in our communities. So we are in a period of growth and have been in a period of consistent growth, which is awesome for Itasca County, but it also presents with it then some challenges in terms of keeping up with our housing needs. The other thing I would say is if that study produced some numbers like she has for the state here, 300,000 new homes. I do know that the core area of our county here, Grand Rapids, Cohasset, La Prairie, there was about 400 units needed across all income spectrums that went from affordable housing all the way up to single family and market rate housing. And then we have some numbers that are needed for Nashwauk and Big Fork also. So we definitely do have a need here too.
This is just going a little bit deeper to get you to think about what are some of those other factors that may produce challenges. One thing I will say is that I have not seen any study that has said that there is kind of what you might call the silver bullet. Like if you can affect this one thing, it will make the difference. But all of these things can help, and all of these things can drive either further challenge or further incentive for those housing. One thing that's kind of gotten a lot of conversation lately is kind of how is your local community either supporting certain types of housing and how is that working? Other things that are a big issue right now, availability of workers to work on the construction process. And that has been another huge challenge that has been driving up costs in producing delays and being able to move forward with your housing goals.
I would just add to that I think right now we're in a period of everybody knows construction costs and construction materials and supply. That's all affecting developers' ability to construct housing at a price point in which makes sense for communities.
All right, so after all these downers, we wanted to talk about what are some of the solutions that we see and things for you to think about. And we'll raise up some of these, and then I hope that you have some questions, because both Diane and I can go super deep. We're going to try not to right now, so that it responds to your questions about what are some of these ideas. And we're actually going to focus mainly on state resources and local housing trust fund. Just a touch, that's okay. What was there? So the first one I wanted to mention was the federal government. If we had a graph on here that talked about resources for housing from the federal government over the past 20 years, I think we would see, you know, just this line that kind of goes like this, because those resources have been reducing. And yet, the federal government is one of kind of the largest supporter of housing at all levels through its various programs, much more so than the state or what local government can do. So it's kind of this continuum. I think you have the most control over doing exactly what fits your community at the local level. You have somewhat of that control at the state, but it's harder. And then federal government has the most resources, but yet it's the hardest to kind of feel like you're affecting. So American Rescue Plan, I just wanted to flag this because there are significant resources, some of which are dedicated to housing and some of which are optional to use for housing that are within the American Rescue Plan Act. We're actually, MHP, we're going to produce a webinar on October 29th where we dive into a little bit deeper how the state and local fiscal recovery funds can be used for housing. Within that section, as an example, it does allow use under certain conditions for housing development, for things like weatherization, for housing services. So it's just something that we want to keep in mind, are these resources that can be utilized, or how can they accelerate the priorities of your community? So these are just a couple highlights of some of the more common programs at the state that support housing. The first program, if the popular name is the Challenge Fund, is actually a kind of longer name, but the Challenge Fund is a program that's been in existence for many years at Minnesota Housing. It's a competitive fund. It's funded somewhere between 25 million to 30 million each biennium and by appropriation. So the Minnesota legislature decides on that and appropriates money to this fund. And it's used for grants and loans for housing projects that can be single family, community land trusts, multifamily projects, and it's intended to be divided evenly between Greater Minnesota and the Metro. A second popular program to keep in mind is called the Greater Minnesota Workforce Housing Program. This program is fairly small. It often is in kind of that $4 to $5 million range. I will say that there was a request this past session to fund it at a higher level, but it didn't make it all the way through the legislature. This is, I will say, it's a program that has a lot of benefits. It is dedicated to Greater Minnesota communities. It is a more simple and straightforward application that doesn't have some of the red tape and complexities of some of these other application programs, and it can fund market rate programs. And then we wanted to highlight something actually MHP has worked on, which is an affordable housing tax credit. This is a brand new program, which is very rare. This is modeled on a program from North Dakota called the Housing Incentive Fund. And the way this works is that it is essentially what we would call a donation tax credit, where taxpayers can donate to this fund, and then it's administered through grants and loans to fund housing projects. Primarily, those contributors would be business contributors, but they could be individuals. So it is also something that is designed to be a public-private partnership in more of that true sense of needing to work together on housing goals and find that sweet spot of how can we advance our goals together. Funded at $10 million a year for 6 years, doesn't start until next year. So this is the period where the agency will be working on the guidelines and starting to get out information that can be shared more broadly. One of the other things that's unique about this is that it's designed so that you could contribute to a specific project or to a general pool that would be administered. So again, this is designed so that if you had a project within your community and you were able to attract some contributors through this mechanism, that would be a way you could support a local housing initiative.
Question.
I have a question. What's the challenge fund called? I'm sorry.
Yep. The full name is the Economic Development and Challenge Fund, I believe. I was just saying I need to look that up. It starts with, it's a longer name, so I apologize.
My question, your $10 million a year, that max for the whole state of Minnesota? That is max per individual?
Yeah, so there will be a limit per contributor of $5 million. This is, excuse me, of $2 million. I'm sorry. We've worked on this many years and I'm kind of going back to the original construct of it. So yes, it's at $10 million a year for 6 years. So a total of $60 million for this program. I'll also say it has a couple of set-asides in the design. So 10% of the funds are set aside to go to communities of 2,500 or under. Another 15% is, excuse me, another 25% is set aside for single family development. And then 35% of the fund is set aside for those projects that would serve lower income residents at 50% AMI and under.
But to answer Burl's question, is the $10 million, is my understanding, is the max per year for the entire state, correct?
You're kidding me.
So
That's less than 100 homes.
yeah.
You need 300,000 homes.
Yeah, yeah.
And you cut us at, not even at the ankle, you're at, a kiki toe for 100,000.
So I will just say I share your frustration at the amount. We had asked for a different amount and we just didn't get there with the agreement of the legislature. So I do think that this is important feedback that both for me to kind of take back, but also to kind of share with lawmakers what's needed as they, try to assess, how they make those decisions with their funds.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes, sir.
Sure.
I hate when I hear that it has to be used a certain percentage, has to be used in metropolitan let's call it the 7-county metro, and us rural counties, the other 80 counties in Minnesota, get just a little slice. You don't even get 50%. I mean, I today I heard it one time, rural Minnesota is going to get 50% of a dollar, which is just mind-boggling because I've never heard it in the last 10 years. I mean, it's time that the state of Minnesota, and man, I know you don't have the power to make change like this, but it's mind-boggling that rural Minnesota isn't kept up on a pedestal when it comes to housing.
And again, I think we absolutely agree with your comment. I would say I do. There's needs across the state. Rural Minnesota has a lot of housing needs, and so you're absolutely right. I mean, we need to advocate for dollars for housing. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. I think I was just going to add in terms of state resources, a couple of things and caveats and things to think about is that almost always when you access these pools of funds through the state or the federal government for that matter, of course, there's conditions on use. And I'm kind of prefacing what can we do locally, which I'm going to talk about next. But almost all of these sources of funds that we would receive into our community are going to require some sort of affordability. So there's going to be some sort of income limit as a restriction put on those dollars. And those income limits are not established locally. Those would be given to us by the federal government. So we just need to remember that when we do access state resources, that there are going to be some strings attached with that money. Also, the dollars are extremely competitive. Oftentimes when Minnesota Housing gets an application, they will get 5 applications to every 1 application they can fund. So oftentimes we or a municipality or someone who's sending in an application to the state, we might have to go in 3 different times, and that means 3 different years successfully or successively in order to get our application funded, because oftentimes those funding rounds are 1 time per year. So there's just a really high demand. And finally, I just would like to say, for if there's any municipalities represented here or the county, local support of housing is extremely, extremely important to the state when they look at our application. And that can often mean some local funding into a project. It just ends up making our projects more competitive at the state level. The final thing, and I know we're running a little bit short of time here, so I'm just going to quickly go through this. If you are a municipality here in this room, you've probably already heard me spout this up, but I really want to have us locally think about a local housing trust fund. Local housing trust funds can be established by a local unit of government, so a city, a county, or the state itself. And you can dedicate public revenues to a distinct fund or a distinct bucket that is used specifically for housing needs in your community. The reason that I think this is important for us to at least investigate and consider in our communities here is it provides us local flexibility, no strings attached. What do we need for housing? What does Nashwauk need for housing? What does Bigfort need for housing? What does Grand Rapids need for housing? We can incentivize housing. We can do that with these local dollars. The other thing is it does encourage some other dollars to come into those funds, whether that be philanthropic, it could be local businesses, it could be individuals. We can just start to grow that housing trust fund bucket so we can incentivize housing. There's currently about 13 jurisdictions in Minnesota that have already established local housing trust funds. And some of the common uses are vast. I mean, you can use them for a lot of different uses, but some of the things that I see communities using them for are preservation of single family homes, first-time home buyer programs, maybe down payment assistance to get our first-time families into home ownership instead of rental. But really the advantage of them is to jumpstart housing in our communities. And the other reason I bring them up today very quickly here is for the first time ever, the state has allocated money as a match. You're only eligible for the match if your community has established a local housing trust fund. So in fiscal year 2022, there's been $1 million allocated. It's initially a 1-to-1 match up to $150,000. So if a community was able to put $150,000 into and establish a local housing trust fund, they could, in concept, get a match from the state to double that money. If funds remain in that bucket after the initial application round, there can be some additional matching up to a total of $300,000 per community. Again, the application details for this aren't even out. We don't know exactly how the program's going to run yet. But I certainly think it's good to get ahead of the curve if we have communities here in Itasca County that are interested in that. I saw a question.
Can the American Rescue Plan funds that each city or municipality is getting towards that?
It can, but you still have to meet the requirements of the American Rescue Plan. Similar to any other pass-through funds, you have to meet the requirements from that original source.
And with that, that's really our presentation today, and we want to just open it up for questions and comments. Susan.
Thank you, Diane. So the last thing we talked about that
The trust fund.
So does that have to be held at the city or county, or could it be held at community foundation? The funds we should also encourage individual donors to contribute.
Do you want to answer that?
Sure. So it's the responsible unit will be the creator, which has to be local government. But that unit of government can designate an administrator. That administrator could be an outside entity, but then there always is reporting and requirements back to that authorizing body. So yes, that could happen. And that, you know, so that would be a decision of the local government unit.
I guess I just think it would have been looking at encouraging individuals to donate to this. There might be a little higher sense of security if it's going to manage the fund as opposed to a fear of it just being dumped in the city or the county.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a local decision.
Yeah, and those are all local decisions. And usually, if you look at the models that have been established, and I've got a list of the communities in Minnesota that have established a local housing trust fund, you know, Red Wing, it's not just Metro, it's, you know, Red Wing and some of those kinds of communities. Then they'll set up an advisory board. I'm not sure that's what they actually call it, but it's a local group then that controls that fund and decides what housing projects and how is that money going to be spent. So it's really, really local control. And you know, we just don't usually see that in dollars, housing dollars.
I might give one example, which is of Rochester. So I just say this because they have something, they call it like a trust fund. It doesn't meet the actual state statute definition, but I think both Olmsted County and the city have given regular contributions to a housing fund, which is held and administered by the Rochester Foundation. And so they're partners, but it's a little different from a local housing trust fund because the city and the county aren't the ultimate responsible authorities. So they've made a little different decision and had a little different model, but still they're seeing government contributions that are leveraging these philanthropic dollars. So again, kind of there's a multitude of things that you can do.
I haven't heard anybody talk about manufactured housing. Now, in today's world, if you still think it's a trailer that you can pull with a truck and it's only 2-inch walls, that's not the case. 25% of the population in the U.S. lives in a manufactured home. This could be a modular, or this could be a 1680 like you would think of as a mobile home. Why don't we ever talk about that for affordable housing?
I think there is a conversation about that. I think there is also at the legislature a lot of lawmakers that are highly interested in this. A lot of communities that see that as the most logical option. I'm working right now with Itasca County, and that is what they are seeking is manufactured home producers that are going to help them increase with selected communities their housing supply. I think one of the challenges is we need to see more investments, so more of that can be produced at a bigger scale, and that's one of the missing pieces right now.
What do you mean by bigger scale?
More producers that are able to produce a greater number of those units. I think we're still seeing some challenges, at least from what I hear. And you may be more familiar with some producers where you're not hearing that. So I'm not trying to be an expert. This is not my expertise area. I'm a little bit more repeating.
Yeah, and it's not my expertise area either, bro, but I do think that conversation is being elevated at the state level. And I think we need to continue to push that because I do think that you can end up producing a home at a less cost potentially. And so what I've seen the state do is when we were pushing for looking at this issue, they were putting money, and what I've seen is them put money into mobile home parks where they're updating the infrastructure of the park versus actually increasing the supply of housing. And that's probably important too, right? We need to have the infrastructure there. And we do have a lot of failing mobile home parks throughout the state, but that doesn't still get at the core issue. I think of what you're saying is that that is probably a viable option for the state of Minnesota to be looking at, to be able to produce more units of housing at a lower cost point or at a lower price point.
I would just kind of add on to that comment of the discussion around tiny homes, you know, because mobile home parks tend to have a negative stigma attached, but you see places like, I think out in Colorado, they've kind of re-envisioned, you know, these tiny home communities that you can call them, I mean, they look similar to some mobile home parks, but they're like, they're aesthetically pleasing, they're, you know, affordable, they're useful. So I think like reimagining that, so that maybe it's not the way it's always looked, to be kind of fit into the current trends.
And there is an interesting project that Duluth is doing on tiny homes. So I'll be interested to see how that goes in our region and how they fund that. And actually there's going to be a short presentation on that in early December that I'm hoping to attend to just see how they're doing that in Duluth. But that is maybe something that could be replicated in our region.
I was curious about how often you're seeing community land trusts pop up, as like I think a lot of that long-term trajectory of affordability, it's attached to mortgages and subsidies go into the mortgage timeline, whereas a community land trust will be affordability connected to the land. And I'm curious what you're seeing in development around that across the state.
Yeah, my colleague who's not here, Libby, is working a little bit more with some community land trusts. So I don't know how we're seeing kind of that trajectory in terms of increasing, but I will say that these are utilized all across the state. So we have service across, and there are certain funding sources from the state that do allow use by a land trust, including bond proceeds. So there's ways that from the state, there can be resources to augment that. And I think that's another just important area where also local government can decide, is that a priority and is that an option for augmenting funding for some special projects?
I would just say regionally, to add to that really quickly, One Roof Housing out of Duluth has done that very successfully. And it to me is an interesting concept for the development of single family housing here, where we could bring down the cost of a single family home by having a land trust model. So again, I think we have a resource here in the Northeast region that we could tap into if communities are interested in that. Isaac.
I just wanted to add, there are generally not very many community land trusts in the state. It's all relative though, but Moorhead, Minnesota recently had the most recent edition of the community land trust producing homes. And so I encourage looking at them. They've got the numbers in there for their business plan, and they have the targets they have to hit. So often you have density and other things that come into play. So we just don't have too many, but it's an idea that is emerging more and more properly.
Thanks for that tip.
I just had a comment because I'm intrigued with the land trust models too, and they had done some work up the North Shore, smaller multi-family buildings. So I'm kind of interested in that small, smaller unit count, below 20, that maybe even more Cook or not being said but smaller communities, right?
And I think that's an interesting concept, and it would be interesting to find out how that financial model worked out, because you can do smaller sized units, because what's happening is if you access the federal low-income housing tax credit program, you're not being able to get the economies of scale to do a 20-unit project.
Exactly what I've been
doing. And so the problem is then there's no major source of funding, development funding, to bring into a multifamily project to do smaller projects in smaller communities. So that would be an interesting concept to look at.
So question, maybe Tom know this a little bit better, but where are we sitting in our area as far as how much more capacity does our public utility system between water and sewer in the treatment plant have available for us to even add housing before we have to do something like that.
Our wastewater plant was designed for 15 million gallons per day. Right now we're using gallons per day. Yeah, and that has to do with Landon becoming more efficient, shutting down line 5, but we have massive capacity.
Okay, so that's not an issue, but
Cost.
the cost of expanding that availability is,
Yes.
seems to be a big issue.
Right.
And, you know, as far as development goes, you know, we've seen more of from the real estate community, the market rate stuff is just a huge gap that needs to be filled, and whether it's filled with manufactured housing, single family housing. There's a huge gap where there's some availability for some affordable housing, and there's projects coming down the line to fill that portion. You've got your custom homes for people that can afford that. But the middle folks that, you know, don't meet the income guidelines, but yet they can't afford to build a custom home, there's a huge gap there in the middle that just needs to be addressed. So I think that's a challenge for our area for sure. And secondly, you know, our contractors that are in the area don't have the workforce capability of fulfilling that need. They're booked out. Anybody that you possibly want to have you build a doghouse is booked out for 2 years right now. So, you know, there's nothing available as far as capacity for folks to actually build those units that, you know, exist in our community right now. So then you're stuck with, are you going to try and attract developers from out of the area? And then, you know, and then you get a whole bunch of pushback from, you know, XYZ developers coming in and taking our jobs. And, but in the first place, we don't have the people there to fill the jobs. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of things fighting each other that need addressing.
Just a quick anecdote on cost of development. Cost. We have single family residential lots at West Elementary School. They appraise for half of what we have into that. So we're selling them at half of what we're testing. So $25,000 lot, we got $50,000. Private development perspective, that is a challenge that
You don't mind?
story, and go ahead, Forest Hills. Perfect.
I'll give you Forest Hill.
Yeah.
Okay, before we can sell a lot, I gotta put water in, sewer in, power in, road, gutter.
Right.
Gotta donate so much to the park system, gotta have so much green space. Okay, how I get to sell them? Guess what happened? When we, as you saw, the graphs, had a great time being housing business. Should have dropped it. It just did, you know, 5 acre lots. We'd have been a lot better off, or should have applied for a gravel permit because there was so much gravel in that hill. Right? That ain't allow me to put a gravel permit in the city of Grand Rapids, so that was off the deal. But you know, so 2 years ago we sold five lots. Okay, we made $1,000 per lot. Don't get me wrong, we've been paying on them for what, 12, 14 years. Okay, $1,000 a lot is what we made. And if you look back in the tax that was owed, you notice that we made $5,000 more than what we had to pay in property tax that year.
So probably being generous and saying they made $1,000.
I am being generous.
When you look at the carrying cost that it's had for 15 years.
I'm not talking about the grass cut, or, you know, none of that. So it's very challenging in today's market, and when something changes where market rate developers get money, you know, W.D. Jones, nice company, they got it down. but they're in a certain small percentage of what they do. You know, low income, what they do, they know it's a 15-year trip, 20-year trip, maybe. At best, I gotta do a remod at that point in time, now I go market rate. There's my guidelines. You know, unless I want to re-up, then I get more money. You know, I get to raise rates. It's a challenge. I will tell you that, you know, when I talk about one way of doing, you know, manufactured homes, they're built in a environment that's, you know, stable. They kick out 20 homes a day, you know, and that's per manufacturer. You know, no different way to find a truck driver to get it to you. You know, he or she still got to get it there, still got to place it, still got to, you know, when I can buy a new home, a 3-bedroom home, you know, 2 bath for 70 grand. Challenges is can you put it on a piece of property? Will the township, city, or county allow you to do it?
For time, Brooke could go on for hours. But you guys, we are at time. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to get to your next program. But if you would please give a round of applause for the presenters. If you guys have additional questions, obviously.